My neighborhood branded Peter a killer after he saved my brother's life. When I proved his sister died of undiagnosed cardiac arrest, they said I'd ruined everything. I just watched them turn away. That was a year ago. Yesterday, I saw children playing in Olivia's memorial garden, safe because Peter taught them to swim. I was 14 when Peter moved in next door. The moving truck hadn't even finished unloading when my mom grabbed my arm. That's the boy whose sister died because of him. He was supposed to be watching her. The way she said it made my skin crawl. Within hours, the entire neighborhood knew. An 8-year-old girl was dead because her older brother was irresponsible. Parents whispered at mailboxes. Poor family, losing a child because their son couldn't do one simple thing. My dad was even more direct. That boy has blood on his hands. You stay away from him. I watched from my window as other parents literally pulled their kids inside when Peter appeared. He'd spend hours alone in his backyard, just staring at this small garden patch, completely isolated from everyone. I watched Peter for the next few weeks, and what I saw made my stomach turn. Neighbors would literally cross the street to avoid walking past him, grown adults. When he'd walk to the corner store, parents would grab their children's hands and hurry them away like he was contagious. The grocery store employees would follow him through every aisle, hands on their radios, waiting for him to steal something. But here's what cowed me. Despite being treated like a monster, Peter never stopped being kind. He built shelters for stray cats in his garage, left food out every night. When Mrs. Blake fell on ice, Peter was the only one who helped her up while others just watched. The kid they called a killer was the only one showing any humanity. Everything changed the day my little brother fell through the ice at the neighborhood pond. We were playing hockey when we heard the crack. Luis went under instantly. The other kids scrambled away screaming. No adults around. I was frozen in panic. Then Peter appeared out of nowhere. No hesitation. He dove straight into that freezing water. I'll never forget watching him pull Luis up, his own lips turning blue. He performed CPR while I just stood there useless. My brother coughed up water and started breathing. Peter sat there shivering, hypothermic, making sure Luis was okay until the ambulance arrived. Then he just disappeared. Didn't wait for thanks. Didn't want credit. At the hospital, my parents' first words weren't about Luis being okay. Where were you? How did this happen? When I told them Peter saved him, my mom's face went dark. He probably pushed Luis in first. This is exactly what happened with his sister. He creates danger, then plays hero. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad was already on the phone. We need to file a report. This dangerous child needs supervision. Within days, the police were at Peter's house for a wellness check. Child services showed up next. The social worker's car in their driveway became neighborhood entertainment. People stood on lawns watching, satisfied that something was finally being done. They threatened to remove Peter from his parents' care because he saved my brother. Then the neighborhood completely lost it. Someone made an anonymous call reporting Peter as a threat to neighborhood children. I saw Peter's mom collapse in their driveway, sobbing, his dad trying to board up windows while people took photos. They were actually considering sending Peter away just to protect him from our neighborhood. I found him behind the abandoned elementary school, knees pulled to his chest. She asked me to take her swimming that morning, he said without looking up. I almost said no to play video games instead. He explained he was teaching Olivia to kick in the shallow end. Then she went limp. He pulled her out instantly, performing CPR alone for 3 agonizing minutes before help arrived. I did everything right. Perfect compressions, rescue breaths, tears streamed down his face. But I kept thinking if someone better was there, she'd be alive. My parents look at me different now. What if I'm a monster? I knew I had to do something. The way Peter's voice cracked when he talked about his parents looking at him differently made my chest tight. I stood up and brushed dirt off my jeans. Peter stayed curled up against the wall, but I saw him watching me from the corner of his eye. I walked home with a plan forming in my head. My parents were in the kitchen when I got back, huddled together over coffee. They stopped talking the moment I walked in. My mom's eyes were red-rimmed, and my dad kept drumming his fingers on the table. I went straight to my room and opened my laptop. Something about Peter's story didn't add up. An 8-year-old girl suddenly going limp in shallow water, perfect CPR that didn't work. I started searching for information about sudden cardiac events in children, drowning statistics, anything that might explain what really happened to Olivia. The next morning, I slipped out early before my parents woke up. Peter was already in his backyard, kneeling by that small garden patch. He didn't look up when I approached, but his shoulders tensed. I sat down next to him without asking. The garden was full of purple flowers I didn't recognize. Peter's hands were covered in dirt as he carefully pulled weeds from around each plant. He finally spoke after several minutes. His voice was barely above a whisper. He told me these were Olivia's favorite flowers. She'd planted them the week before she died. He'd been taking care of them ever since, even when the neighbors threw eggs at their house or left nasty notes in their mailbox. I helped him devil's lettuce in silence for a while. Then I mentioned my research from the night before. Peter's hands stilled. I explained what I'd found about sudden cardiac arrest in children, how it could happen without warning, how even perfect CPR sometimes wasn't enough. Peter's whole body started shaking. He hadn't known. Nobody had told him about these possibilities. The doctors at the hospital had been too focused on the drowning aspect, and his parents had been too devastated to ask questions. The police report just said accidental drowning, case closed. I spent the next few days digging deeper. I found medical journals about undiagnosed heart conditions in children, statistics about survival rates even with immediate intervention, cases eerily similar to Olivia's. Each piece of information felt like a small weight lifting off my chest, and I imagined it might do the same for Peter. But when I tried to share what I'd found with my parents, my mom slammed her coffee mug down so hard it cracked. She grabbed my laptop and closed it. Her face was flushed and her hands were trembling. She told me to stop filling my head with nonsense. The boy was dangerous, and that was final. My dad backed her up, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it. He said I was being manipulated, that Peter was playing mind games with me. They forbade me from going near him again. When I protested, my dad stood up so fast his chair fell over. He pointed at Luis, who was coloring at the table. Did I want to lose my brother too? That night, I heard them arguing in their bedroom. My mom's voice was high and frantic. She kept saying something about not letting it happen again. My dad's responses were muffled, but I caught phrases about keeping the family safe and doing what was necessary. I snuck out my window the next night. Peter was sitting on his back porch, staring at the stars. I showed him printed copies of the medical articles I'd found. His hands shook as he read them by the porch light. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but for the first time since I'd known him, they seemed different, like relief mixed with grief. He told me more about that day, how Olivia had been laughing just seconds before, how she'd been practicing her kicks perfectly, how there had been no struggle, no panic, just sudden stillness. It all matched what I'd read about sudden cardiac events. We started meeting in secret after that, sometimes behind the abandoned school, sometimes in the woods at the the edge of the neighborhood. Peter would bring Olivia's medical records that he'd found in his parents' filing cabinet. I'd bring new research. Together, we started piecing together a different story than the one the neighborhood had decided on. But secrets don't stay hidden in small neighborhoods. Mrs. Blake saw us talking one afternoon and immediately called my mother. I came home to find my laptop missing and my bedroom door removed from its hinges. My mom said I'd lost the privilege of privacy until I learned to make better choices. The punishment escalated from there. They took my phone, canceled my after-school activities. My dad started driving me to and from school, watching until I walked inside. They even made Luis sleep in their room, afraid I might somehow put him in danger by association with Peter. The neighborhood seemed to feed off my parents' fear. More people started calling for Peter's removal. Someone spray-painted child killer on their garage door. Their car tires were slashed twice in 1 week. Peter's mom stopped leaving the house entirely. I watched it all from my window, feeling helpless and furious. Every time I tried to defend Peter, to share what I'd learned, I was shut down, grounded further, isolated more. My parents started talking about sending me to stay with my aunt in another state, just for a while, just until things calmed down. One evening, I overheard my mom on the phone. She was talking to someone about Peter's family, her voice low and urgent. She mentioned something about a meeting, about finally taking action, about how some stories were better left buried. The way she said it made my stomach drop. I realized then that this wasn't just about fear or misunderstanding. Someone in our neighborhood knew more than they were saying. Someone had reasons for keeping the narrative focused on Peter's guilt, and my mother seemed to be part of it. I pressed my ear against my bedroom wall that night, straining to hear more of my mother's phone conversation. Her voice carried through the thin drywall in fragments. She mentioned hospital records and something about a favor someone owed her from years ago. My hands clenched into fists when I heard her say Peter's name with such venom. The next morning brought new restrictions. My father installed a lock on my window from the outside. My mother stood in my doorway, watching me pack my school bag, checking every pocket and folder. She found the medical articles I'd hidden between textbook pages and tore them into pieces without a word. At school, I discovered my parents had spoken to my teachers. Mrs. Catherine pulled me aside after first period, explaining that I'd been moved to a different lunch schedule for my own safety. The principal's office had received concerns about my judgment. I spent lunch alone in the library, watched by the librarian who kept glancing at me over her glasses. Peter wasn't at school that day, or the next. I saw his father's car leave early each morning, but their house remained dark and quiet. The purple flowers in Olivia's garden began to wilt without Peter's daily care. On the third day, I managed to slip away during gym class. I ran to Peter's house, my heart pounding. His mother answered the door, her face gaunt and eyes hollow. She shook her head before I could speak, then slowly closed the door. Through the window, I saw Peter sitting at their kitchen table, staring at nothing. That afternoon, my mother was waiting in the school parking lot instead of my father. She drove us to a different route home, past the community center where a meeting was apparently scheduled for that evening. She pointed to the building and told me the neighborhood was finally going to solve the Peter problem. Her satisfaction made me feel sick. I pretended to do homework while secretly watching the clock. My parents left for the meeting at 7, taking Luis to a neighbor's house first. They locked me in my room, but I'd been preparing. I'm feeling so much pain for both these kids right now, watching them trying so hard to find the truth while the adults around them are building these walls of fear. The way Peter's hands shook when he read those medical articles, and how his tears seemed different, like relief mixed with grief. That really shows how much he needed someone to believe that maybe it wasn't his fault. And seeing his mom answer the door with those hollow eyes and just close it without speaking, that silence feels very heavy. I'd loosened the screws on my window lock over several nights using a butter knife I'd hidden. The lock came free with effort. I climbed out and ran through backyards to avoid being seen. The community center's parking lot was full. Through the windows, I could see dozens of neighbors packed inside. My mother stood at the front with a stack of papers. I crept closer, hiding behind the dumpster. The side door was propped open for air, and voices carried clearly. My mother was reading from what she called evidence of Peter's dangerous behavior. She listed every time he'd been seen alone, every interaction with neighborhood children, twisting innocent actions into sinister patterns. Mrs. Blake spoke next, describing how Peter had touched her when helping her up from the ice. She made it sound predatory instead of helpful. Other neighbors added their own twisted versions of events. They were building a case that Peter was escalating, that Luis had been targeted, that no child was safe. My stomach churned as I realized they were planning to present this to child services, to demand Peter be removed immediately. Someone mentioned they had a contact who could expedite the process. Another neighbor, Mr. Benjamin, offered to organize a petition. They discussed taking shifts watching Peter's house to document his movements. I needed evidence of my own. I slipped away from the community center and ran to Peter's house. Their car was gone, probably at the meeting trying to defend their son. I remembered Peter mentioning Olivia's medical records. If I could find proof of a heart condition, something the hospital missed, it might change everything. The back door was locked, but Peter had shown me where they kept a spare key under a fake rock. My hands shook as I let myself in. The house smelled like sadness and untouched dinners. I found the filing cabinet in the home office and started searching. Olivia's medical folder was thin, too thin. I found routine checkup forms, vaccination records, nothing unusual. But behind the folder, I discovered something else. Hospital discharge papers from 3 years before Olivia died. She'd been admitted for chest pains and irregular heartbeat. The doctor recommended follow-up cardiac screening that, according to the empty space in the file, never happened. I photographed everything with an old digital camera I'd found in the office. As I was leaving, headlights swept across the front window. Peter's family was home. I slipped out the back, my heart racing, clutching the camera. Back in my room, I uploaded the photos to an old laptop I'd hidden in my closet. The medical terms were complex, but the pattern was clear. Olivia had shown signs of a cardiac condition years before her death. The recommended tests were never done. Maybe they couldn't afford it, or maybe they thought she'd outgrown it. Either way, Peter couldn't have known. My parents returned late, talking in hushed, excited voices. Through my door, I heard my mother say the meeting went perfectly. They had enough concerned citizens to force action. The call to child services would be made first thing in the morning. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Peter's face when he talked about Olivia. I thought about his parents, already destroyed by grief, about to lose their son too. The neighborhood had decided Peter was guilty, because it was easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things just happen. Before dawn, I made a decision. I printed copies of Olivia's medical records and wrote a detailed explanation of what I'd found. I made 30 copies using my old printer, working as quietly as possible. Then I climbed out my window one more time. I went to every house where I knew families with children lived. I slipped the evidence under doors, into mailboxes, taped to windows. letters. Each packet included Olivia's cardiac history and articles about sudden cardiac arrest in children. I wanted them to see the truth before the morning's phone calls. The sun was rising when I finished. I was exhausted and dirty, but I felt lighter somehow. I climbed back through my window just as I heard my parents stirring. I shoved the printer under my bed and pretended to sleep. The explosion came at breakfast. My mother's phone rang constantly. She kept saying she didn't know what they were talking about, hadn't seen any medical records. My father grabbed one of the packets from our own doorstep, his face darkening as he read. They confronted me immediately. My mother's face was red with rage. She demanded to know how I'd gotten the records. When I stayed silent, she grabbed my shoulders and shook me. My father had to pull her off. She screamed that I'd ruined everything, that I didn't understand what I'd done. Through my window, I watched neighbors emerge from their houses, holding the packets, talking in small groups. Some looked confused, others ashamed. Mrs. Blake tore hers up without reading it, but I saw others studying the medical information carefully. My parents locked me in my room again, but the damage was done. The phone rang all morning with neighbors calling to discuss what they'd learned. I heard my mother trying to do damage control, insisting the records could be fake, that it didn't change Peter's negligence, but doubt had been planted. Around noon, Peter appeared in his backyard. He knelt by Olivia's garden and began pulling weeds, just like always. But this time, Mrs. Kathy from 3 houses down walked over. She stood awkwardly at the fence before handing him a watering can. They didn't speak, but Peter nodded his thanks. My mother saw it too. She stormed outside and confronted Mrs. Kathy, their voices carrying across the yards. Other neighbors watched from windows and doorways. The carefully constructed unity was cracking. That evening, my father informed me I would be going to stay with my aunt immediately. They couldn't trust me anymore, he said. I was a danger to the family, to Luis, to everything they'd tried to build. My mother wouldn't even look at me as they packed my things. I managed to see Peter once more before they took me away. He was in the garden at dusk, and I called to him from my window. He looked up, and for the first time since I'd known him, he almost smiled. He raised his hand in a small wave, then returned to tending Olivia's flowers. The car ride to my aunt's was silent, except for Luis crying in the back seat, not understanding why I had to leave. My mother sat rigid in the front seat, her knuckles white as she gripped her purse. My father kept checking the rearview mirror as if expecting someone to follow us. At a rest stop, while my father pumped gas, my mother finally spoke to me. Her voice was low and bitter. She told me I thought I was so smart, so righteous, but I didn't know the whole story. I didn't know about the family who lived in Peter's house before them, about their daughter who drowned in the community pool 10 years ago, the same pool where Peter had been swimming that day with Olivia. She said the neighborhood had worked hard to move past that tragedy, to make the community safe again. Peter's family moving in, bringing another drowned child, had reopened old wounds. It was easier to blame him than to admit their perfect neighborhood was cursed with coincidence. I stared at her, realizing the depth of the delusion. They'd created a mythology to avoid facing random tragedy. Peter was just their latest scapegoat. My mother turned away, done with explanations. At my aunt's house, I was given a small room and strict rules. No phone, no computer, no contact with anyone from home. My aunt, my mother's sister, looked at me with pity and disappointment. She'd been told I was going through a rebellious phase, that I'd endangered my family by associating with a dangerous boy. I spent 2 weeks in isolation, wondering if the seeds of truth I'd planted had grown or been stamped out. My aunt monitored my every move, reported back to my parents daily. I heard her on the phone describing my behavior, assuring them I was showing signs of improvement. Then one morning, my aunt seemed different. She watched me over breakfast with a strange expression. Finally, she asked if I wanted to talk about what really happened. I was suspicious, but desperation won. I told her everything about Peter, Olivia, the medical records, the neighborhood's mob mentality. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she pulled out her phone and showed me a social media post. Someone had shared Olivia's medical records online, along with a long post about rush to judgment and community hysteria. The post had been shared dozens of times. Comments poured in from people expressing shame and regret. My aunt admitted she'd had her own doubts about the story she'd been told. My mother had sounded too frantic, too insistent. She'd done her own research after I'd arrived and found the same medical information I had. She'd been wrestling with what to do. I asked if I could go home. She shook her head sadly. My parents weren't ready. The neighborhood was in upheaval. Some families were doubling down on Peter's guilt, while others were publicly apologizing. Peter's family had received several apology letters, but also fresh vandalism. The community was splitting apart. My aunt let me use her computer to research more about sudden cardiac arrest in children. I compiled a comprehensive document with case studies, medical explanations, and statistics. I sent it anonymously to everyone I could find in our neighborhood's online directory. Knowledge was the only weapon I had from a distance. Days passed slowly. My aunt began treating me less like a prisoner and more like a guest. She asked questions about Peter, about what I'd observed. She seemed particularly interested in his kindness despite the cruelty he faced. She said it reminded her of something, but wouldn't elaborate. One evening, she told me a story. When she and my mother were young, they'd had a neighbor who was blamed for a playground accident. The community had turned on the family, driven them away. Years later, they learned the accident had been caused by faulty equipment, not negligence. My mother had been one of the loudest voices against that family. My aunt wondered if my mother's extreme reaction to Peter was connected to that old guilt. Maybe she couldn't face being wrong again, or maybe she was repeating patterns, finding someone to blame because accepting randomness was too hard. Either way, my aunt was beginning to see why I'd fought so hard for the truth. She made a decision. She called my parents and said she was bringing me home for a visit. My mother protested, but my aunt insisted. She said isolation wasn't helping anyone, and that the family needed to face this together. The call ended with my mother crying and my aunt standing firm. The drive home felt like approaching a storm. My aunt gripped the steering wheel tightly, occasionally glancing at me with encouragement. She'd printed out some of the online discussions about Olivia's case, comments from medical professionals confirming that sudden cardiac events could strike without warning. As we entered my neighborhood, I saw the changes immediately. Peter's house no longer looked abandoned. The vandalism had been cleaned off. Their garden was thriving, with new plants added alongside Olivia's purple flowers. Several neighbors were in their yard, helping with maintenance, but other houses had for sale signs. The community had fractured. Those who'd led the charge against Peter were either doubling down or retreating in shame. The unity built on shared suspicion had collapsed, leaving awkwardness and resentment. My house looked exactly the same from the outside, but felt different as we pulled into the driveway. My father met us at the door, his face tired and older somehow. I can feel the weight of that car ride, the silence heavy with fear and anger, and learning about that other drowning 10 years ago really shows how grief can twist a whole community into creating stories to avoid facing that sometimes terrible horrible things just happen, without anyone to blame. He hugged me stiffly, then led us inside where my mother waited in the living room. Luis ran to me immediately, wrapping his arms around my waist. The conversation that followed was painful. My mother accused me of destroying our community, our safety, our peace. I responded with facts about Olivia's medical history. My father tried to mediate, but his heart wasn't in it. He looked defeated, caught between his wife's certainty and mounting evidence. My aunt intervened, sharing her own research and the online discussions. She pointed out that the truth would have emerged eventually, that I'd simply accelerated it. She asked my mother directly if she really believed Peter had hurt Olivia, or if she just needed someone to blame. My mother broke down then, not in acceptance, but in fury. She screamed about protecting her family, about preventing another tragedy. She brought up the previous drowning, the pattern she saw. When my aunt pointed out that 2 unrelated incidents over a decade didn't make a pattern, my mother accused her of being manipulated too. The argument escalated until my father intervened. He announced we would be staying with my aunt for a few more days while he and my mother worked things out. My mother protested, but he remained firm. For the first time, I saw him stand up to her hysteria. As we prepared to leave again, I saw Peter in his backyard. He was surrounded by several neighbors, including Mrs. Kathy and Mr. Benjamin. They were planting new flowers together, expanding Olivia's garden. Peter looked up and saw me watching. This time, his smile was real. My aunt drove us to a hotel instead of her house. She said we needed neutral ground. Over dinner, my father finally opened up. He admitted he'd had doubts about Peter's guilt from the beginning, but had been swept up in my mother's certainty and the neighborhood's mob mentality. He'd been afraid of being ostracized if he defended Peter. He showed me his phone. He'd been in contact with Peter's parents, apologizing for our family's role in their persecution. They'd been gracious but honest about the damage done. They were considering moving, starting fresh somewhere else. The thought made my chest tight. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about Peter tending Olivia's garden alone for months, maintaining her memory while being branded her killer. I thought about his parents, grieving their daughter while fighting to keep their son. I thought about my mother, so desperate to assign blame that she'd convinced herself and others of a lie. The next morning brought unexpected news. The hospital where Olivia had been treated was conducting an internal review of her case. Someone had submitted her earlier medical records and raised questions about the missed cardiac screening. It wasn't about assigning blame, but about preventing future tragedies. My father took the call, his face grave. He looked at me with something like respect. My actions had not only cleared Peter's name, but might help save other children. The hospital was implementing new protocols for cardiac screening in young patients with any history of chest pains or irregular heartbeat. We returned home that afternoon to find my mother packing boxes. She informed us coldly that if we insisted on supporting that family, she would stay with her sister. My father tried to reason with her, but she was beyond reach. Louise clung to her, crying, not understanding why everyone was fighting. I made one last attempt. I asked her to come with me to Peter's house, to see Olivia's garden, to talk to his parents. She refused, but something in my voice must have reached her because she paused at the door. She said she knew I believed I was right, but some truths were too dangerous to expose. Then she left. The neighborhood felt different without her presence, quieter, but also more honest. My father struggled to maintain normalcy for Luis while processing his own guilt. He'd chosen the mob over his conscience, and now his family was fractured. I finally got to speak with Peter properly. We sat in Olivia's garden, now expanded into a memorial space. He thanked me for finding the truth, but his voice was hollow. The damage was done. His parents were selling the house. They couldn't stay where their daughter died and their son was tortured for it. He showed me a letter from the hospital. They'd reviewed Olivia's case and confirmed what I'd suspected. She'd had an undiagnosed cardiac condition that could have been detected with proper screening. Her death was a preventable tragedy, but not through Peter's actions, through systemic medical oversight. The letter should have brought relief, but Peter just looked tired. He said the truth didn't erase the months of hatred, the vandalism, the threats. His parents couldn't look at neighbors who'd smiled while calling their son a killer. They needed a fresh start. I understood, but it felt like another injustice. Peter's family was still being punished, just differently. They were losing their home, their community, because the neighborhood needed a villain more than it needed truth. The real guilty parties faced no consequences beyond private shame. Over the following days, several neighbors approached me. Some thanked me for revealing the truth. Others blamed me for dividing the community. Mrs. Blake refused to accept the medical evidence, clinging to her narrative, but Mr. Benjamin apologized profusely, admitting he'd been swept up in fear and group thinking. The fractures in the neighborhood deepened. Those who'd led the charge against Peter either doubled down or withdrew entirely. Those who'd stayed silent wrestled with their complicity, and those who defended him felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow for not doing more sooner. My father tried to hold our family together. He took time off work to care for Luis and me. He attended therapy to understand how he'd been so easily swayed by mob mentality. He wrote a long letter to Peter's family, taking responsibility for his actions. They responded graciously, but maintained their decision to move. I spent my last days before Peter left helping expand Olivia's garden. Other neighbors joined us, trying to make amends through action. We planted purple flowers and installed a small bench with a plaque reading, "In memory of Olivia, who loved to swim and laugh and grow beautiful things." Peter worked alongside us, quiet but no longer alone. The garden became a space for the community to confront its failure. Some couldn't handle the reminder and avoided that corner of the neighborhood. Others visited daily, leaving small tokens or tending the plants. My mother called occasionally, speaking only to my father. She remained convinced she'd been protecting us from danger. She couldn't accept that she'd been the danger, that her fear had created the very monster she imagined. My father stopped trying to convince her, focusing instead on healing the damage within our reach. The day Peter's family moved, half the neighborhood came to help and say goodbye. The other half stayed hidden in their homes. I helped Peter carefully transplant some of Olivia's flowers to take with them. He promised to keep tending them, to keep her memory alive in a place not poisoned by false accusations. His mother hugged me before they left. She whispered that I'd shown more courage than all the adults combined, but she also said courage came too late to save them from the pain. They needed to go somewhere Peter could just be a grieving brother, not a neighborhood monster. As their car pulled away, I felt the weight of what had transpired. The truth had won, but at tremendous cost. Families were broken, trust shattered, a community divided, all because fear and gossip were easier than compassion and investigation. My father put his hand on my shoulder as we watched them go. He said I'd done the right thing, even if the results were messy. Truth usually was, but living with lies was worse, even if it felt safer. He promised we'd work to rebuild, to learn from this tragedy. That evening I sat alone in Olivia's expanded garden. The purple flowers flowers swayed in the breeze, beautiful and indifferent to the human drama surrounding them. I thought about Peter, starting over somewhere new, carrying the weight of unjust accusation alongside his grief. The neighborhood would eventually heal, find new routines, new gossip. Some would learn from this, becoming slower to judge and quicker to verify. Others would find new targets for their fear and suspicion. But Olivia's garden would remain, a reminder that truth matters, even when it comes too late. Luis found me there as darkness fell. He crawled into my lap, still confused by all the changes. I held him close, promising myself I'd teach him to question, to investigate, to choose truth over comfortable lies. It was the least I could do to honor Olivia's memory and Peter's undeserved suffering. I walked back inside to find my father sitting at the kitchen table with Luis, helping him with a puzzle. The pieces scattered across the surface reminded me of our fractured neighborhood. My father looked up and gestured for me to join them. His eyes held exhaustion, but also determination. Over the next few days, I watched my father transform. He started attending neighborhood gatherings again, facing the uncomfortable silences and pointed looks. He approached families individually, acknowledging his role in the persecution. Some accepted his apologies gracefully. Others turned away, unable to forgive. Mrs. Blake remained the most resistant. She organized a small group of holdouts who insisted Peter's family leaving proved their guilt. They met at her house weekly, reinforcing each other's delusions. I saw them through her window one evening, heads bent together over coffee, still plotting. My father discovered Mrs. Blake had been spreading new rumors. She claimed I'd broken into Peter's house to plant the medical records, that the whole thing was an elaborate hoax. She even suggested my family had been paid off by Peter's parents to change our story. The situation escalated when Mrs. Blake confronted me outside the grocery store. She blocked my path with her shopping cart, her face twisted with anger. She accused me of destroying their safe community, of putting children at risk. Other shoppers stopped to watch the scene unfold. I stepped around her cart without engaging, but she followed me through the store. She narrated my every move to other customers, warning them about the dangerous teen who defended child killers. The store manager eventually intervened, asking Mrs. Blake to leave me alone. That night, my father received multiple calls from neighbors. Some had witnessed Mrs. Blake's behavior and were concerned. Others supported her, believing I needed to be held accountable for my actions. The community's fractures were hardening into permanent divisions. My father made a decision. He organized a neighborhood meeting at our house, inviting everyone regardless of their position. He spent days preparing, gathering all the medical documentation, research papers, and expert opinions I'd collected. He wanted one final attempt at reconciliation. The evening of the meeting, only 12 people showed up. Mrs. Blake and her supporters boycotted. Those who came seemed tired, worn down by months of conflict. They sat in our living room with careful distances between them, like magnets with matching poles. My father presented the evidence methodically. He showed Olivia's medical history, the missed cardiac screening, the statistics on sudden cardiac arrest in children. He read statements from medical professionals who'd reviewed the case. He kept his voice steady, factual, avoiding emotion. Mr. Benjamin spoke up first. He admitted he'd been wrong, that fear had clouded his judgment. You can feel how much she appreciates what was done, but also how deeply their family has been wounded by everything that happened in this neighborhood. The way Peter carefully takes some of Olivia's flowers with him to keep tending them in their new home shows such a beautiful way of carrying his sister's memory forward, without all the ugly lies that got attached to it here. Peter is the GOAT. He described how his own daughter had recently been diagnosed with a heart murmur, making him realize how easily tragedy could strike any family. His voice cracked as he apologized for his role in tormenting Peter. Mrs. Kathy shared her own revelation. She'd researched the previous drowning my mother had mentioned, the one from 10 years ago. She'd found newspaper archives showing it was caused by a pool drain malfunction, not negligence. The family had won a settlement from the manufacturer. There was no pattern, just tragic coincidence. One by one, others began sharing their regrets and realizations. They spoke about mob mentality, about how easy it had been to believe the worst. They acknowledged the cruelty they'd participated in, or enabled through silence. The room grew heavy with collective shame, but not everyone was ready for reconciliation. Mrs. Victy, who'd initially seemed sympathetic, suddenly stood up. She announced she couldn't listen anymore, that we were rewriting history to make ourselves feel better. She left abruptly, taking 2 others with her. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months began tentatively reconnecting. Plans emerged for repairing the community, including a memorial fund in Olivia's name for cardiac screening for local children. It felt like a small step toward healing. Over the following weeks, the memorial fund gained momentum. My father threw himself into organizing it, perhaps seeking redemption through action. Local businesses donated, and even some who'd boycotted the meeting contributed anonymously. The fund quickly raised enough for several screenings. The first screening day arrived on a Saturday morning. Families lined up at the community center, children clutching parents' hands. I volunteered to help with registration, watching nervous parents fill out forms. 3 children were identified with previously undetected heart conditions. 3 potential tragedies prevented. One mother broke down crying when she received her daughter's results. She hugged me tightly, whispering thanks through her tears. Her daughter needed immediate treatment for a condition that could have culled her during sports, or even while sleeping. Peter's suffering had led to her child's salvation. Mrs. Blake watched from across the street, arms crossed. She'd forbidden her grandchildren from participating, calling it a publicity stunt. But I noticed her expression wavering as she watched families leaving with relief or urgent medical referrals. Seeds of doubt were finally penetrating her certainty. The hospital that had treated Olivia reached out to my father. They wanted to feature our community's memorial fund in their new cardiac screening awareness campaign. They offered to provide free screenings quarterly and train local teachers in recognizing warning signs. My father accepted immediately. I returned to school to find the dynamics completely changed. Some classmates treated me like a hero, others like a pariah. Teachers watched me carefully, unsure how to handle the student who'd upended an entire neighborhood. I focused on my studies, avoiding both praise and confrontation. My mother called less frequently. When she did, she spoke only to Luis, filling his head with promises of visits that never materialized. My father stopped putting her on speaker, protecting Luis from the manipulation. Their divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a neutral party. Luis struggled with the changes. He had nightmares about drowning, about ice cracking beneath his feet. He'd wake up calling for Peter, the boy who'd saved him, but whom he'd been taught to fear. My father found him a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. I started visiting other families who'd lost children to sudden cardiac events. I collected their stories, creating a presentation for schools about the importance of screening. Each family shared their pain, but also their gratitude that awareness was spreading. Their children's deaths might might save others. One family showed me their daughter's room, preserved exactly as she'd left it. On her desk sat a science project about the heart she'd been working on before she died. Her mother said she'd been complaining of chest pains, but they'd assumed it was anxiety about starting middle school. The parallels to Olivia were haunting. The presentation grew into something larger. The hospital invited me to speak at a medical conference about community awareness and the dangers of rush to judgment. I declined media interviews but agreed to share our story with medical professionals who could use it to save lives. At the conference, I met other families who'd faced similar situations, communities that had blamed parents for accidents that were actually medical events, children ostracized for tragedies beyond anyone's control. The pattern of seeking someone to blame rather than accepting randomness was disturbingly common. A pediatric cardiologist pulled me aside afterward. She explained how many childhood cardiac conditions went undiagnosed because symptoms were subtle or dismissed. She thanked me for my courage in pursuing the truth, saying my actions would ripple outward in ways I couldn't imagine. Back home, the neighborhood continued evolving. The for sale signs gradually disappeared as new families moved in, unaware of the recent turmoil. The old guard who'd led the persecution either adapted or retreated into isolation. Mrs. Blake stopped attending community events entirely. My father and I worked to maintain Olivia's garden. We added a small plaque explaining the memorial fund and listing the number of children screened. Visitors often left flowers or small donations. The garden became a place of reflection rather than accusation. On the anniversary of Olivia's death, I received an unexpected package. Inside was a photo of Peter kneeling in a new garden, purple flowers blooming around him. His mother's note explained they'd found peace in their new town. Peter was volunteering with a youth swim program, teaching water safety. He'd found a way to honor Olivia through service. The photo showed Peter smiling genuinely, no longer the haunted boy I'd known. Behind him stood other teenagers, kids who saw him as a mentor rather than a monster. His parents had included a pressed purple flower from Olivia's new garden, a tangible connection between past and present. I kept the flower in my journal, alongside all the medical research and documentation. Sometimes I'd flip through the pages, remembering the journey from suspicion to truth. The cost had been enormous, but the alternative would have been worse. Living with lies corrodes communities from within. My father eventually started dating a woman from the next town over. She knew our story, but judged us by our actions rather than our past. Luis warmed to her slowly, finding in her the stability he'd lost. Our family was reshaping itself, different but not broken. The memorial fund reached a milestone of 100 children screened. 5 had been identified with serious cardiac conditions requiring immediate intervention. 5 families spared the grief Peters had endured. The numbers felt both triumphant and heartbreaking, representing lives saved and lost. I graduated high school with plans to study public health. My experience had shown me how community health extended beyond physical ailments to social diseases like mob mentality and rush to judgment. I wanted to address both, to prevent tragedies and the secondary trauma of false blame. My mother never returned. She remarried someone who didn't know our history, creating a new life built on careful omissions. Luis spoke to her monthly, but the calls grew shorter and less frequent. He was building his own understanding of truth and family, guided by hard-won wisdom. On my last day before college, I visited Olivia's garden one final time. The purple flowers bloomed magnificently, tended by rotating volunteers who'd embraced the memorial's mission. Children played nearby, their laughter mixing with birdsong. The space that had once symbolized accusation now radiated hope. I thought about Peter, somewhere distant, teaching kids to swim, about Olivia, whose death had ultimately saved others, about my mother, trapped in her inability to admit error, about my father, who'd found redemption through action, about Luis, growing up with hard truths rather than comfortable lies. The garden would continue without me, as would the screening program and the slow work of community healing. My part in this story was ending, but the ripples would continue spreading. Truth, once released, couldn't be contained. It would find its way into hearts ready to receive it, changing lives in ways both small and profound. As I walked away, I noticed Mrs. Blake watching from her window. For a moment, our eyes met. I saw something shift in her expression, a crack in the armor of certainty she'd worn for so long. I nodded slightly, then continued walking. Some journeys toward truth take longer than others, but the destination remains the same. The neighborhood looked different now, neither the perfect community my mother had tried to preserve, nor the battlefield it had become. It was simply a place where people lived, flawed and struggling, capable of both cruelty and redemption. The truth hadn't healed everything, but it had made healing possible. I drove past Peter's old house, now home to a young family unaware of its history. Children played in the yard where Peter had once stood alone. The past lingered in the soil and memories, but life had moved forward. The cycle of blame had broken, replaced by something more honest, if less comfortable. My father waited at home with Luis, ready to drive me to college. Our family had survived, transformed but intact. We'd learned that truth could shatter illusions and relationships, but what remained afterward was stronger because it was real. The easy lies had nearly destroyed us. The difficult truths had set us free. This ending fills my heart with so much hope and peace for everyone who was touched by this tragedy. The way Mrs. Blake finally showed a crack in her certainty gives me hope that even the most stubborn hearts can start to change. That's all for today though. Thank you so much for watching.